everyone, it's Amanda from Hookemcreations. I'm so glad you're here today, and if you're new, welcome. This is a place where we can talk about knitting and crocheting and pretty much anything in the fiber arts. And I'm just glad that you're here and joining us, and let's get started. So today I am talking about circular knitting needles. I am so excited about this actually because I enjoy knitting on circular knitting needles. It's one of my favorite things to knit on. I don't care for straight needles as much. I do enjoy double pointed, but I really enjoy circular knitting needles. Now, I know I covered this in like a very brief video on like how to get started in knitting and things like that, roughly, but this is a little bit more in-depth video of circular knitting needles. And there are many sets out there on circular knitting needles. There's some that's already attached, where the cables are already attached to the needles. There are interchangeable needles. I have multiple interchangeable needles sets, and I have a few that are already connected together. So I am going to show you briefly how you can use them. There are many different ways you can use them, but for the most part, it's pretty much like knitting on any other knitting needles. First thing you're going to need to know about your circular knitting needles is the length of your needles. So there are a few different types of measurements that you'll need to know. If you have the circular knitting needles where the cable is already attached to the needles, you're going to measure it from tip to tip, and that is the entire length of your circular knitting needles. If you have interchangeable knitting needles like I do, this is a set that I own. I am working my way to owning a bamboo wooden set. I have my eyes set on a few sets, but they can be very expensive. So this is a cheaper version than I have. They work very well. I haven't had any major problems with them. So with circular knitting needles, if they're already attached, you're going to measure tip to tip. So tip of the knitting needle to tip of the knitting needle, and that is your length. Now, with interchangeable, they have multiple sizes with the cables. And you got to be careful with cable needles or with interchangeables, because based on the brand that your knitting needles are, they're not going, the screws, the screws are not going to always be the same. So you can't always use like a cheap set that you get from Amazon and put it with a big name brand, because sometimes they're not all the same thread. That's what it is. They don't all have the same thread for your knitting needles. So if you are going to have a specific brand, stick with that specific brand's cables and needles, so that way they are all the same and they will stick. Now, the downside, one of the major downsides with interchangeable knitting needles is they tend to, if you don't tighten them, they tend to unscrew themselves. I've had this happen multiple times, and I've lost stitches this way. So just be careful if you do use interchangeable, because they will, after using them for some time, sometimes they get loose and you drop stitches. So how you attach them is quite literally you screw it on like so, All right, and it's nice and tight. What you will have in your kit is a key. It's quite literally like a little pin like this. You're going to stick it into this tiny little hole. If you can see it, there's a little hole right there. Stick it in there so it's nice and flat, and you're going to screw it on, tighten it up like a lug knot, and then you can try, and you're going to try and tighten it as much as you can, and then you're ready to go. And then you do it for the other side as well. Don't lose these. I have a little container of knitting supplies that I kind of keep all of my stuff in there, because my kids like to get into my stuff and just lose everything. so make sure that you don't lose it. So I'll show again on the other side real quick. Is you just take your knitting needle, screw it on, take the pin and screw it on as tight as you can. Go ahead and take it out and put it where it is going to be safe. And then your knitting needles are ready to go. So there are going to be multiple sizes of cables depending on the kits that you get or the sets that you get. They also are sold individually, as well as knitting needles. I try and do sets if I can. Then that way I try and save money, because buying individually can get really, really expensive. However, there are times where I'm like, but I have this project on these set of knitting needles, so I go and buy another set, and that's what happens. Or I have a set of knitting needles, but they're not long enough and they're not interchangeable, so I have to go get another set. That's longer. That's always the problem with circular. Sometimes you think you have the right length and you don't. So with the cables attached, this cable is 15 inches. These needles are 4 inches apart. What you'll do to measure the full length is you take your tape measure and go from tip to tip. And we're looking at about, roughly 23 inches. Because these are bent right here. It's to help kind of, if you work in circular, they're to help with the circular part of the round. So some of them are like that, not all. Well, yeah, not all, because I have a set over here that I'm going to show you guys in a minute that isn't bent that way. But it helps to have them slightly bent if you're going to work like with hats and stuff that is in a round, or sweaters if you're working in a round rather than just panels. Knitting panels on circular knitting needles, I have no problem with them, unless I have a cable that's too long and it gets a little twisted, kind of like this project that I have here. So this is my project that I have on circular knitting needles. That is a panel project. This is a triangular shawl. I don't remember the name of the pattern off the top of my head. If I remember, I'll have to look it up, and then I'll just leave the name on the screen of the name of the pattern. It was a free blog post, and any of the and I'll also leave a link in the description box below for the pattern that I'm showing you here. So this is just a simple project, and with this panel, you're working it just like you would on straight needles. The only thing is that it's just going back and forth on the circular knitting needles, and you're not going just straight back and forth like this. It's just kind of like going up and down on like a roller coaster in a way. So like, yes, it is like working on straight needles, but the only thing is it just stays on a loop the entire time. I find that I don't lose a lot of stitches a whole lot. And here's my knitting needle. This one is completely straight. And these are my bamboo or wooden knitting needles that I have and I really like. And knitting on a panel on circulars is really nice. I actually enjoy it. I don't like knitting panels on straight needles a whole lot anymore because they just kind of get in the way and they get clunky and stuff. This is very nice. It just stays in your lap and you just kind of go work back and forth on your panel, and it just kind of stays all enclosed onto your lap and you're not hitting anybody or anything while you're knitting. Now, the other way, which is probably the most popular with circular knitting needles, is working in the round. So this is a hat that I am working on, and this is completely in the round, like literally you're working in a circle continuously until the crown of the head, and then you close it up. And I'm getting to the point where I am going to close it up here soon. And so as you're working in a round with circular knitting needles and you start to do decreases on your project, with knitting there are a couple ways you can do the decreases. One is transferring your project from circular knitting needles over to double pointed knitting needles and just kind of work with that. And again, some people don't like double pointed knitting needles because it just kind of, because one, I mean, they're pointy on either end and it's just, they're straight and they kind of get clunky and it's kind of hard to work with at times depending on the project that you are working on. A lot of times people who are knitting socks, they will either work with double pointed needles, or in some others will work with what's called the magic loop. And it's basically working with circular knitting needles, and what you do is you take your project, and here, I'll have to demonstrate it. Give me 1 second. All right, so if you have cable needles that are longer than what the pattern suggests for, there is a way to work around it. Some people will even do this for like sleeves and socks rather than using double pointed needles. I prefer using double pointed needles. I like them, so other people do not. So here is another method that you can use. It's called the magic loop, and it's very, very easy. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your project and fold it in half like I'm doing, and you're going to take your cable and you're just going to pull it until you put the stitches on your needles, just like that. And then you just work it like you would as if there was no magic loop in the back there, and you can just work it as is, just like that. Nothing to it. It's pretty simple. Other people will no, it's just pretty simple. That's it. And you just work it around like you would for your project. And that's it. And you just keep working all the way until the very end. And then you just do the whole thing all over again. That's it. That's simple. That's how you do the magic loop if you ever want to just keep it on circular, your project on circular needles, and you don't want to switch it over to double pointed knitting needles. And that's really about it with circular knitting needles. There's not a whole lot to it. It's pretty much like just one continuous loop, whether you're going back and forth or you're working in the round. They're pretty easy to work with. I enjoy working with them. I prefer them over my straight needles any day of the week. If I can work with either double pointed or circular needles, those are my main choice. However, there are times I do work with straight needles, don't get me wrong. I have my projects that I like to work with straight needles, don't get me wrong about that. But that's pretty much it. I hope this video was very informative on how to work with circular needles, as well as like what they are and what you can do with them. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment about which is your favorite needle to work with, whether it's circular needles, double pointed needles, or just regular straight knitting needles. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell and get notified of when my next video comes out. I have a video that comes out at least once a week, if not more. If I have any bonus videos, get notified for when those come out too. Until next time, happy crafting.